There are good goalies, there are great goalies, and there are also important goalies. And he was an important goalie.
You got to appreciate the character of Jacques Plante. That's what amazed me the most about him. It's having the guts to go and say, hey, I'm not going back if I don't have a mask.
Well, I see a goaltender who will play better than Plante did. I have my doubts. I really do.
Jacques Plante, the stubborn, courageous goaltender, was born on January the 17th, 1929, in a farmhouse near Mont-Carmel, Quebec. Plante's family lived in poverty, first on the farm and then in Shawinigan, where his father worked as a machinist at the Aluminum Company of Canada. Jacques was the oldest of 11 children. Next in line, his sister, Thérèse.
Jacques, c'était quelqu'un de spécial.
Jacques was someone special because he was a leader. He was always in front, first in everything, and we followed him.
9 months after his birth, the stock market crashed.
Mon père était le seul qui travaillait. Il était journalier.
My father was the sole breadwinner. He was a factory worker. He worked at an aluminum plant to feed and educate 11 kids. How they managed, I'll never know. My mother was the one who managed the budget, but in the house, everyone helped. Whether it was housework or tidying up, whether it was a boy or girl, it made no difference.
Jacques Plante began to play hockey at the age of 3. At 7, he got his first real goalie stick and learned from his mother how to knit.
That's when he started knitting things, his toques. He was cold because the skating rinks were outdoors. So his mother would tell him, "You're going to learn to knit because I can't knit for everyone." So he started knitting. It was because of the poverty that he learned to be self-sufficient.
And he was good. He was very fast and he didn't drop any stitches. Toques, hockey socks, he did a lot of those. It's true.
At that time, there was no organized hockey like there is today. So he'd play in the schoolyard. His father made him some shin pads and a goalie stick, so he started very young. But when the time came to play in the arena, it cost 10 cents to play in the arena, and he didn't have 10 cents. So he used to stand at the door of the arena and say to the guys that arrived, "Listen, if you need a goalie for your team, well, I'm ready to play." Eventually, he was playing a lot in the arena for several different teams.
By the age of 12, hockey had become a passion.
At night, when the Montreal Canadiens played hockey, this was before television, he was not allowed by my parents to listen to the game on the radio because the game ended too late. My bedroom was right below the living room of the man who lived on the second floor, a real hockey fan. So, when the man turned on his radio to listen to the game, Jacques would cross over to my room, he would stand on my bureau, and he would listen to the game through the ceiling.
And his dream was to play for the Montreal Canadiens.
He would say, "You know, Thérèse, in a few years it's going to be me that will be the goaltender for the Montreal Canadiens." That was his dream. He really wanted to be a goaltender.
Plante began his hockey career as a defenseman, but he had difficulty breathing. "If it wasn't for my asthma," he once said, "I would have stayed on defense and never got beyond school hockey." By the time he was 15, he was playing for 4 teams at once and at 4 different levels: midget, juvenile, junior, and intermediate. And he played goal for a Shawinigan manufacturers team for 50 cents a game. In 1947, he got his high school leaving diploma and decided to play with the Quebec Citadels. It was with Quebec that Plante began to show his potential as an innovator.
There was a time when he was playing for the Quebec Citadels that he started coming out of the net. Now, that was a change that he brought to hockey. People would see that and say, "It's impossible. Goalies don't leave their nets." But he did.
Plante explained the reasons for this innovation. He said, "Ahead of me were 4 defensemen with assorted flaws. One couldn't skate backwards, one couldn't shoot the puck up to the blue line, one of the other 2 could only turn one way. Somebody had to clear loose pucks, and I began to do the job myself. It worked so well that I kept right on roving."
That was a big barrier to get over for coaches. And that's the sense that the visual of the open net. I mean, years later, Toe Blake, still had nightmares of Jacques Plante going out of his net.
In 1948, Plante, the Rover, was the hero of the Citadels when they beat the Junior Canadians in the finals.
Jacques came out of Schwenningen, and he was the guy we had to beat. My duty was to swing my stick in front of his face so it'd make his eyes blink.
In October 1948, Plante met Jacqueline Gagné in Quebec City. In December, they became engaged, and they were married the following May. He graduated to the Montreal Royals, where one of his new teammates was an old adversary, Dickie Moore.
He played the game like a first baseman, his glove. I would say even in today's hockey, there's no one catches that puck like Jacques Plante did.
But despite his obvious talent, it was not easy to break into the NHL.
In those days, the Montreal Canadiens had the first choice of all the Francophone players in Quebec. They had the rights to many of the best players in the game. That's why it took Plante so long to make it to the National Hockey League. And Montreal already had a great goalie, Bill Durnan. He was the best goalie in the league, and it was impossible to think of replacing him.
In 1951, the first of Plante's two sons, Michel, was born, and Jacques tried his hand at making home movies. But on November the 1st, 1952, Plante got his big break. The Canadiens' goaltender, Jerry McNeil, who had replaced the retired Bill Durnan, suffered a fractured jaw in a game against Toronto. Plante was called up on a 3-game trial and was told by coach Dick Irvin that he'd be starting against the New York Rangers.
I thought he was very good. I keep saying that to myself today. I needed a good goalkeeper to replace me. If it was a guy that wasn't so good, I wouldn't feel so good.
But before Plante could replace McNeil, he had to endure the Battle of the Toque.
No, when Jacques Plante wore the toque, we playing against him, we teased him. We'd try and pull it off with our stick sometimes from behind the net. But I mean, he went through hell to wear that toque. I was there when the coach says, you don't play if you wear it. And that's hard for a kid that's coming out of nowhere and be strong enough to say, I want to wear it. And today you have to be proud of him for standing up for his rights.
Irvin said that wearing the toque would expose Plante to ridicule, and that if it fell off during the game, Plante might try to pick it up and stop following the puck.
C'est que la tuque, j'ai commencé à la porter parce qu'on voit dans des patinoires extérieures lorsque j'étais jeune. Alors, il faisait froid nécessairement, il fallait se couvrir les oreilles. Quand j'ai commencé à jouer dans les patinoires intérieures, les patinoires n'étaient pas chauffés, encore là, il faisait froid. Et comme je suis asthmatique, je ne voulais pas attraper de rhume, alors j'ai gardé la tuque. Et quand je suis devenu gardien de but régulier des Citadelles, on a commencé à parler de Georges Vézina, puis la tuque. Et en fin de compte, je l'ai gardé jusqu'à ces 3 matchs que j'ai joués en 52 avec le Canadien. Là, je me préparais à aller jouer. Mes tuques étaient disparues, je n'avais toujours 2-3. Et je demande à l'entraîneur, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Je ne sais pas, ils sont disparus.
Plante lost the Battle of the Toque, one of the few battles he'd lose in his career. Plante went on to beat the Rangers 4-1. In the next 2 games, he tied them 2-2 and beat the Maple Leafs 3-1. His 3-game trial was an unqualified success. In January 1953, the Canadiens signed him to an NHL contract. It was for $9,100 per year. They sent him down to the Buffalo Bisons, their minor league farm club. The press there called him Jake the Snake. The Canadiens said the minor league experience would do him good, and they would soon be proven right. The Buffalo Bisons didn't make the playoffs that spring, but Plante's dejection was short-lived. He was brought in to be Jerry McNeil's backup in the Stanley Cup playoffs. On April 4th, 1953, in Chicago, Coach Irvin caused shockwaves when he asked the rookie, Plante, to play goal instead of Jerry McNeil. Chicago was leading the semifinal series 3-2.
Alors à 7 heures, lorsqu'on se prépare pour aller au stadium de Chicago, dès qu'Irvin m'appelle, il dit Jacques, il dit c'est toi qui gardes ce soir. J'avais aucune notion que je serais d'un but. Jerry McNeil était en santé, tout ça. Alors j'ai commencé à trembler. Rendu en chambre, j'essayais de lancer mes patins, c'était impossible, je ne pouvais pas le faire. Et là, Maurice Richard est venu me voir, puis il dit, Jacques, il dit, dans un match de même, il dit, tout le monde est énervé. Puis il a mis sa main comme ça, puis il tremblait également. Alors ça veut dire que...
Plante had a shutout in his first playoff game. 3 days later, he led Montreal to a 4-1 victory, and then they advanced to the Stanley Cup Finals. He played goal for the first 2 games against Boston, winning the first and losing the second. The Canadiens went on to win the series, and Jacques Plante's name appeared on the Stanley Cup for the first time. After spending most of the next season back with the Buffalo Bisons, Plante began the 1954-55 season as the Canadiens' first-string goaltender. McNeil was not prepared to share goaltending duties, and he retired.
Things weren't going that well, and the pressure was high, and I think when Dick Irvin started using Plante and myself, it kind of developed, but it wasn't like it is today. Then there was always a reason, and it made it very tough, and I wasn't the type that could handle it.
Plante's second son, Richard, was born in 1955 as Plante completed his first full season in the NHL. He led the Canadiens into the Stanley Cup Finals, but that was overshadowed by a St. Patrick's Day that will never be forgotten in Montreal. For his part in a vicious brawl in Boston, the Canadiens' greatest star, Rocket Richard, was suspended for the rest of the season by NHL Commissioner Clarence Campbell. Fans in Montreal were stunned and angry. When Campbell took his usual seat in the Forum 4 days later, on March 17th, the fans went berserk. A thug attacked Campbell. A tear gas bomb exploded. The building was cleared and the game was forfeited to Detroit. The angry crowd stormed into the night. Looters destroyed St. Catherine Street. Hundreds were arrested. It was the beginning of the end for the Canadiens season. Without the Rocket, they were beaten by Detroit, and Jacques Plante would have to wait at least another year for his second Stanley Cup. In the fall of 1955, the Canadiens had a new coach, Hector "Toe" Blake. And there was a new young journalist covering the Canadiens for the Montreal Star. His name was Red Fisher.
I first saw him when I started covering the Canadiens in 1955-56. He was different. He was a splendid goaltender. He's certainly the best goaltender that I ever saw, and I've seen a few over the years. But I got to tell you this about Jacques Plante. He played for Toe Blake for 8 years. Toe Blake hated Jacques Plante. I mean, really hated the guy because Toe liked to be in control. That's what made him a great coach. He controlled the players. He told them what to do. But he just couldn't move Plante around the way he did the other players. And I'm talking about guys like the two Richard and Belleville and Geoffrion and Moore. But I still remember him telling me, in the 5 years that the Canadiens won the Stanley Cup, Jacques Plante was the best goaltender he's ever seen. You have to know Toe Blake to understand how great an admission that is, because when Toe Blake didn't like somebody, everything was bad about the guy. So when he says Jacques Plante was the best that he's ever seen for those 5 years, you know, it's coming from the right guy.
The Montreal Canadiens, under Toe Blake and with Jacques Plante in goal, went on to become the greatest team in the history of hockey. The Flying Frenchmen were almost unbeatable. They won 5 consecutive Stanley Cups, and Plante was a big part of that success.
Jacques was a big instrumental player in those parts. He kept us in the game. Like, I can go and talk about Boston. It's like yesterday when they'd hold us in our zone for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. And Jacques Plante would keep us in the game, or they wouldn't let them score. We needed that goaltending, and he was the guy that did the job.
But Jacques Plante was more than simply a great goaltender. He was a complete and obsessed student of the game.
He used to sleep thinking hockey. He would wake up playing the game. I mean, this guy, believe me, knew hockey inside out. He studied every hockey player that played against him. He knew how if they slapped shot or if they deked or what have you. He knew all their shifts on the ice.
I've never met anybody who studied the game as much, who knew more about the game, who knew more about the job that he had to do about the game, who was more proud of the job that he did in hockey.
And he never hesitated to share his knowledge. Hockey legend Jean Béliveau.
Sometimes the teammates, they like it, sometimes they don't like it. I remember, I think one time he came to me on face-off, and I simply told him, I said, take care of your net, I'll take care of the face-off.
Jacques was also a good father. His son Michel remembers.
As a father, he was giving us a good basic discipline. I really appreciate, because when you have a discipline, when you're at a young age, when you grow old, you can set up your life and you can set up your work and all that. And he was that type of guy, and this is how we were raised.
And he was a unique personality.
Jacques was more of a loner, but he did come to a lot of the team functions. Like after the game, we'd meet and have a few. But if we at that time, we'd ante up $2. Jacques would only put one in, because he said, "I only have one." And if he didn't have his one, he'd pull his one out. So he was that type of guy. But we knew this. That was Jacques.
Was he cheap? Let's say he was a trifle tight.
We used to kid him about that he had the first nickel that he ever made, and he used to have a saying, he threw nickels around like manhole covers, but no, Jacques looked after his money.
And Jacques Plante probably had a few more eccentricities than the average goalie, but they are exactly the same ones that we all have, and I think it's the basic insecurity of the position and of the personality that, that plays it.
He was a loner, even at home, when he wasn't playing with us, or there was nobody around him. He liked to be on his own and read and all kind of book, listen to classical music, taking pictures of birds and filming some birds, and the bird that he had was singing birds, so it was making life in the house, and it was maybe creating for him a different scene, or different environment than to concentrate always on the hockey.
Plante was not only collecting birds, he was also collecting trophies. The 5 Stanley Cups were matched by 5 Vezina trophies for the league's top goaltender. The family mantelpiece was running out of room, and there was plenty of reason to celebrate. But something else happened during this period that would earn Plante more fame and attention than all his cups and trophies. By the late 50s, hockey was beginning to change. The arrival of the slap shot, curved sticks, and bigger players made goaltending more and more dangerous. Bill Birchmore, sales director of Fiberglass Canada and an avid hockey fan, offered to make Plante a fiberglass face mask.
The first mask was built at home. They came to the basement, and they made a plaster mold, and out of that they made the mask itself.
The homemade mask was tested in practice, but Coach Blake refused to let Plante use it in games, claiming it would restrict the goalie's vision. But a shot fired by Andy Bathgate of the New York Rangers on November the 1st, 1959, changed the world of hockey.
I was in New York the night that he first put it on. Andy Bathgate of the Rangers comes down and lets go a short backhand, and I thought it was deliberate, right into Plante's face. And there was a cut from the corner of his mouth that ran right up through his nostril.
I'm telling you, his nose was about here, and that doctor stitched him up.
I was the only guy in there with him, and he's standing in front of the mirror, and he's spreading the cut apart. And it looks pretty ugly, and even he agrees that he and it looked pretty damn ugly. And then he went over to the table where a doctor waited, and he stitched him up, no anesthetic, whole pile of stitches. And then he came out of the clinic and skated across the ice and went to the Canadiens dressing room and put on the mask.
Toe Blake had to choose between a masked Plante or the Rangers' second string goalie.
How he went back in the net, I'm telling you, was not nice to see. And he put the mask for the first time, and Toe Blake had no other choice.
Toe Blake was 100% against the idea of a goaltender wearing a mask.
The hockey players had no objection of him wearing a mask. It was something new. And management had to accept it, and coach had to accept it. But it was a blessing, I guess, when they did accept it. And he proved he could play well with it.
With the mask, Plante played spectacularly. The Canadians won the match. Jacques Plante never played another game of hockey without it.
J'étais receveur au baseball, j'étais gardien de but à la crasse. Et dans les deux sports, je portais un masque. Et au hockey, j'ai été peut-être plus malchanceux que d'autres. J'ai eu le nez cassé 4 fois, les 2 autres la joue cassée, la mâchoire 2 fois, ainsi de suite. Alors, je me suis dit, mais coudonc, si je pourrais être blessé aussi souvent que ça, je suis aussi bien de faire quelque chose pour me protéger. On avait un bon club, on continuait à gagner. Et en 59, quand j'ai commencé à porter le masque, au printemps de cette année-là, on a gagné la Coupe Stanley en 8 parties consécutives. Alors, personne ne pouvait dire, bien, le masque l'empêche de bien jouer. Alors, grâce aux Canadiens et à leur force, ça a permis au masque d'être là plus tôt qu'il l'aurait eu, parce qu'éventuellement, le masque serait sorti quand même.
Jacques Plante's decision to defy his coach and put on his mask changed the way hockey was played forever.
Playing goal is always at least an unconscious compromise between safety and effectiveness. And part of that compromise is if you get hit in the head, it hurts, and or worse. And so you try to keep your head as far away from the action as you possibly can. Now, if you're wearing a mask, you don't need to do it quite as much. So, you know, the impact doesn't stop with safety. It bleeds over, nice word, into effectiveness, you know, and how you play.
You got to appreciate the play of these guys, and also you got to appreciate the character of Jacques Plante and the guts that he had to go out there and say, hey, if you want me back in the net, I'm going on this if I wear a mask.
But the man who changed hockey didn't win any trophies in 1961. The Stanley Cup run was over. The Rocket had retired, an era had passed. Plante had an undistinguished season. His goals against average soared, and despite finishing first in the regular season, the Canadians were quickly eliminated by the eventual Cup-winning Chicago Blackhawks. After the season, Plante had surgery to repair a torn cartilage in his left knee and began an intensive training program. Plante arrived at the Canadians' training camp in the fall of 1961 in terrific shape and played his most extraordinary season. He won his 6th Vezina Trophy, even though his most reliable defenseman, Doug Harvey, had been traded. He also won the Hart Trophy, awarded to the league's most valuable player.
When Harvey was traded to the New York Rangers, of course, the big question that everybody asked Plante, how are you going to do without Doug Harvey on defense? Plante said, listen, we all know what a great defenseman Doug Harvey has been and is, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to win the Vezina Trophy this year without Doug Harvey. Sure enough, he won the Vezina Trophy without Doug Harvey. Not only did he win the Vezina, he also won the Hart Trophy as the most valuable player in the league.
The Hart Trophy would be the last trophy that Jacques Plante would win as a member of the Montreal Canadiens. The 1962-63 season was not a memorable one for Plante. His asthma worsened, and so did his relationship with Toe Blake.
When we went to Toronto, he didn't want to stay at the Royal York Hotel because he said that the bedding in the room brought on asthma attacks. He wanted to stay at another hotel by himself, and Toe Blake eventually let him do that, but just for one game, because you know, Toe and I went to Maple Leaf Gardens one morning to watch the Maple Leafs practice, and we were walking up the steps, and coming around the bend is Jacques Plante with 3 young ladies on his arm. And Toe Blake said, "Good morning, Jacques." Plante said, "Good morning, Toe." Plante kept walking, and Toe and I kept walking with Toe swearing under his breath, saying that so-and-so he'll be back at the Royal York Hotel before he can blink. And of course he was. And that night on the train, Plante said, I want you to know, Toe, those three girls, they were my cousins. Toe said, fine. Your cousins can come and meet you at the Royal York Hotel the next time we're in town. And that was the end of that.
The Canadians finished the season in third place in the six-team league and were bounced from the playoffs in the first round by the Toronto Maple Leafs. On June the 4th, 1962, while Plante was driving to a downtown meeting, he turned on his car radio.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special sports bulletin. One of the most spectacular trades in National Hockey League history has just been announced by the Montreal Canadiens. A 7-player trade with the New York Rangers revolving around their 10-season goaling star, Jacques Plante.
Toe got fed up. They weren't winning Stanley Cups. And he eventually got fed up with Plante's, quote, act, unquote. And he finally, after one season, he exploded, went to Frank Selke Sr. and said, this guy's got to go. And that guy went.
I guess this was the hardest part of his life, because we all had the bleu blanc rouge on our back and our heart, and, and no one wanted to leave this team.
Plante began his career with the Rangers by shutting out the high-scoring Detroit Red Wings, but that was as good as it got in New York. For 2 years, he struggled with a losing team and various real or imagined injuries. Back in Montreal, his wife wasn't well, and he had 2 teenage sons who needed a father.
This was the fact of life, and there was nothing we can do about it. And he still wanted to play hockey, so we just had to get along with it.
He's going right in alone. Pass at the basket. He shoots. Oh, a basket.
2 years of losing was enough for Plante. His retirement was announced by the New York Ranger general manager Emile Francis just before the 1965 NHL June draft. Plante was 35. In 1965, Plante was comfortable in retirement. He worked as a representative for Molson Breweries. He owned a beauty parlor on St. Hubert Street, which amused his former teammates. He played lacrosse for the Caughnawaga Indians and took part in a number of golf tournaments. He was a television analyst for some of the Canadiens' home games.
For me, to have him at home, it was more a relation of friendship because I was getting older, and I felt good having him at home. He could coach me if I was playing baseball during summertime, and so it was good to see him back.
Plante was enjoying retirement. He had no thoughts of returning to hockey. But a young hockey coach, who would one day become the winningest coach in the history of the NHL, had a different idea. On December the 15th, 1965, at the request of coach Scotty Bowman, Plante returned to hockey for one game between the junior Canadiens and the world and Olympic champions, the national team of the Soviet Union.
We used a few NHL players, a few minor league players, and we really weren't as good as the other team in that game, but he had come out of retirement, practiced for about 2 weeks, was anxious to prove himself against the international competition. So he was a star of that game.
He had 3 breakaway at the last minute, and he stopped the Russian, and it was a real good game.
He was spectacular, but why wouldn't he be? He was Jacques Plante. Jacques Plante was spectacular in everything he did. On the ice, off the ice, in the NHL, facing the Russians in a junior game. This was something that had to be done. And Plante did it, because that's what his career was all about.
After stunning the Russians by a 2-1 score, Plante returned to his post-hockey life. There was no suggestion that a return to hockey was in his future. But in 1967, the NHL expanded, adding 6 new teams. And many of those new teams were desperately looking for experienced goaltenders.
Scotty called me up and he says, Dickie, we're thinking of asking Jacques Plante to come to St. Louis. And I said, well, why are you asking me? I said, you shouldn't ask me. I said, ask your goalie, Glenn Hall, whether he wants it. I know how the feeling between 2 people are.
We had some young goalies in our system, but they weren't ready to play at the NHL level. We had a lot of players that had played in the NHL with and against Jacques, so it was a pretty easy transition for Jacques to come with our team because he knew a lot of the players. A lot of them had come up through the Montreal organization.
I suppose that after his first retirement, he found it that he was still enjoying the game. You miss the action on the ice, but you miss, I know in my case, and I can speak for many of my former teammates, we missed this great atmosphere that we had in the room, the great atmosphere we had together traveling on the train. So I'm not surprised.
Anything that Plante did didn't surprise me. But I think when it comes right down to it, you couldn't be a Jacques Plante without loving to play the game. And he did love to play the game, and because he played it so well, and because he was so well rewarded for it.
When he decided to go to St. Louis, it was a surprise for everybody. And it was a great year playing with Glenn Hall, and the team that the St. Louis came up with was real good, and it was fun.
Plante and Glenn Hall combined to win the Vezina Trophy, an incredible accomplishment for two aging goalies playing with an expansion team. After a second successful season in St. Louis, Plante was traded again, this time to the Toronto Maple Leafs.
By that time, we had some young goalies coming up, and we just couldn't keep all our players. We were going to lose some young players, and before we lost him in the draft, we knew he still wanted to play in the league, and we put him on a team that we thought would be good for him, and he went to Toronto and played pretty well.
Plante became a businessman as well. Partner Marc-André Baudin.
We call it the Jacques Plante mask, and we call the company Fibrosport. And when we started the company, well, our first help was his son Michel, which stayed with the company very long, even quite a while after I left.
I'm manual. I like to work with my hand, and my father and I discussed about it. And knowing that he was still involved into hockey, he wanted to have at least someone from the family that could be in place and look at the manufacturer and see how everything was going.
When he was playing hockey, no use talking to him. He was so serious in the business of keeping the goals and studying it all the time and trying to get new ideas, and that it was very difficult. But what happened is that as soon as we start the company, he would come and spend the whole summer with us.
Plante was as successful in business as he'd been on the ice. Fibrosport was soon turning out 25,000 goalie masks a year, and Plante earned enough money making masks that he was able to bank his entire Maple Leaf salary. Plante spent 3 seasons with the Leafs. His goals against average in 1971 was incredible. 1.88, the lowest in the NHL since Plante himself recorded a 1.86 average in 1956. In 1972, Plante was invited to Sweden to teach his technique to young goaltenders. He published Devant le filet, In Front of the Net, his textbook on goaltending. During the series of the century between the Soviets and the Canadians, he was an analyst for Radio-Canada. He was clearly recognized as the master of his craft. In 1973, Plante was traded to the Boston Bruins just in time for the playoffs. Then he negotiated a contract for $1 million over 10 years as coach and general manager of the Quebec Nordique of the newly formed World Hockey Association. His career in management was short-lived.
Well, what you have to understand about people like Plante, who finds himself in an executive capacity after a Hall of Fame career, he expects the people who are playing for him to play the game as well as he did when he was a player. Well, that's impossible. That's why Plante didn't last as the general manager or whatever he was of the Quebec Nordiques.
He was not enjoying life away from hockey either. His 23-year marriage to Jacqueline had ended, and his younger son Richard had passed away. Things at Fibrosport were not going well.
Jacques went into the company and got a large order from them. I think it was 15,000 masks that we had to produce. Maybe they just wanted us out of the business because they made us all kinds of trouble to pay us. And finally, they didn't want
the mask anymore, and we had to go to court. And I know that I was in bigger company after that, and I know that was a way to get rid of a small company in our way is to give him a big order and don't respect it.
Bill Hunter, owner of the Edmonton Oilers, had a solution for the 45-year-old Plante's unhappiness.
Jacques and I had lunch together, and we were talking hockey, and I asked him how he was enjoying this work, and I could tell he wasn't exactly happy. And I suggested that, how would you like to come and play for us in Edmonton? And that led to further discussions, and we ended up landing Jacques.
It was a good move, both for Plante and the Oilers.
Jacques was exceptionally popular with the fans. The phones would constantly ring, "Is Jacques playing tonight?" He meant 2,000 to 3,000, maybe even higher, fans a game to us. And when he came here, he was sensational, to say the least. We were leading the league by some 17 points when he got hurt. And if he had been able to play and play like he was playing, I think we would have not only led the league, we probably could have won it all.
Hockey was not Plante's only passion during his Edmonton days. There was also a new lady in his life.
She was a remarkable lady in her own right. She was from Switzerland, was manager of the concessions at Gerry Park for the Montreal Expos, and did an outstanding job, and they hated to lose her, but she came west with Jacques, and she was a typical Swiss girl who just loved to ski. They did a lot of cross-country skiing together. They'd go for long walks along the river valley. They loved Edmonton.
And it was in Edmonton where Plante played his last game of professional hockey, the end of one of hockey's most brilliant careers.
We were making a road trip to Denver. We were going to fly down and fly back right after the game. We had a charter, and we decided to leave Jacques at home. And lo and behold, he went out and practiced with our Oil Kings, our junior club, and he got hit with a slap shot in the side of the head, right in the ear, and it caused him very serious problems, a loss of balance, and doctors will tell you that's one of the worst injuries an athlete can have. And that ultimately finished his career, because he tried to come back late in the year, but it wasn't the same Jacques.
Jacques Plante retired from hockey for a third and final time. After retiring, Jacques married Raymond Oudrissard and moved to the town of Sierre in Switzerland. One of his neighbors was a Canadian hockey coach named Normand Dubé.
Every morning he would get up, go at the old restaurant there to have his coffee, and he would do his grocery every day. He would live exactly like the people was doing there. So it was very calm. It was like a lot of people here would like to live. For example, like retired people, that's the way people live there.
For sure, Switzerland is not, it's not close to Montreal. It was good for him, that's what he was mentioning, because of his asthma problem. He took the pump and just left it in the drawer and never used it when he was in Switzerland, so his health was better being there.
I could feel during this short time in Sierre that he has become well known, work with young kids, 1 or 2 days a week. Seems to be very well appreciated by many of his friends that I met. And I had the feeling that he was feeling very good living in Sierre.
Plante returned to Canada regularly to work as a goaltender coach for a number of teams.
He used to come in September for training camp. We'll come back maybe right after Christmas and back for the playoff.
You can only teach goaltenders just so much. The rest of it has to come from within you. Plante was a goaltender from the tip of his toes to the top of his head.
Plante returned to Canada for other reasons, too. In 1978, he was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame.
Jacques has to have a little special introduction because he's entirely different. He set an entirely new standard of the way to play goal. He made the thing an art. rather than a profession. He was a little more reliable all the time, and he did more for the game of hockey than all the goaltenders put together since he came in. I read in his book. I hear you've moved to Switzerland because you have all the money salted away in one of those banks, and you're not going to let anybody take any chances.
On December 17, 1983, the Montreal Canadiens invited the players who had been part of those 5 consecutive Stanley Cups to a celebration at the Forum. And on January the 12th, 1985, Plante again returned to the Forum, elected by the fans as a member of the Canadiens' all-time dream team. That would turn out to be Plante's last visit to a place where he had rewritten all the record books and captured the hearts of a generation of fans.
When I had met him the winter before, he'd come in from Switzerland and say hello to us, and he looked very, very good. So when I heard he had cancer, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. I was very, very shocked by it.
It happened very quickly because when he called, he says, Michel, I'm going to Switzerland. I have a cancer, and probably they will operate me over there, and I'll give you a call. And they operate him, and a week after, he died.
On February 27, 1986, Jacques Plante died of stomach cancer in Switzerland. He was 57.
I went to the funeral, and I was very honored when the team here and the league said, Jean, you're the one who know him the best. You would be the guy that the Canadian and the league would need to have somebody there. And I'd gladly do it because I always respect Jacques, whatever style that the man has. So I'd always got good respect for him.
It hurt very much so, because an old teammate we've always have love and admiration for. And he was one that, it was an individual, but he was a great goaltender.
In 1995, the Montreal Canadiens retired sweater number 1, Jacques Plante's number, throughout his career with Montreal.
It's difficult in many ways to describe Jacques Plante because he was so different, such a great goaltender, so much of an innovator. It's difficult to really explain what he was all about. But it seems that he always ended up being a winner, which is what this game or any other game is all about. Like him or not, he was a winner. I liked him.